Hi, I'm Kumi Taguchi. Tonight on Insight, it's 1 year on from the fall of Kabul. What is life like now for those rebuilding here and those left behind?
Afghanistan is being taken to Stone Age, and I see not only Afghan leaders but the international community equally responsible for this reversal.
How does it weigh on you knowing that many of your former Afghan colleagues cannot leave that country?
It's pretty stressful, especially when I get scared.
Those who went on the ground in Afghanistan had the most to lose, but had the least to say about that.
I think we have the watches, they have the time.
The Taliban are in power and the international community is forced to work with them.
If the Taliban see me, they will kill me.
Thank you so much for being here. Khalid, in August last year, you and your family fled Afghanistan on one of those evacuation flights we just saw. How did you feel leaving the country you grew up in?
I felt like my dreams were shattered. I felt like we had been betrayed by the international community. I felt betrayed by US. I felt betrayed by my president and the world that was watching in silence, a terrorist group taking over a country. I never thought I would have to leave my country like this, with nothing but only the clothes that we were wearing and only a single handbag that I was holding.
You and your family were at Kabul airport among the thousands trying to escape. What was that like there?
I was passing through a mixture of emotions, to be honest. It felt like entire Afghanistan has rushed into the airport. We could see people climbing over each other just to get to the gates of the airplanes. We saw coalition forces standing there to help people, for which we are grateful enough. But overall, it was a chaotic scene that we will never, ever forget. This trauma will live on in our hearts forever.
You had been living and working in Kabul as a journalist. What did it mean for you when the Taliban took power?
That was the end, not only for me, but for every bright young Afghan, whether male or female, whether they were journalists, artists, writers from the sports fraternity, actors, singers, doctors, or people who served with the coalition forces, be it interpreters, the drivers, or in any form they served. So it was the end for them.
Did you ever feel like your life was at risk during that time?
It was definitely, because being a strong critic of the Taliban on social media and serving the state broadcaster where we always portrayed Taliban as terrorists, it was indeed in danger.
You have 4 sisters. What did the Taliban takeover mean for them?
Not only for my sister Kumi. Currently we see for every Afghan daughter, sister and girl, the takeover of Taliban means the end of their life. Women are currently confined to their homes in Kabul. The Taliban have no issue with women polishing shoes on the streets of Kabul, but they have issues with women teaching at colleges and universities in Kabul. It has been more than 350 days that girls in Afghanistan are not able to go to schools. Who's going to compensate them for this loss? We see that Afghanistan is being taken to Stone Age. And I see not only Afghan leaders, but the international community equally responsible for this reversal.
Mona, you and your family also escaped Afghanistan in the days after the Taliban took control. How did you get out?
So not just me, me and my family and all of the girls, they are playing like football. We are at national soccer players. So Australian government sent our visas on that day. But before the visas, we wait for 2 days in the airport and hide from the Taliban. I had everything I want. Before the Taliban, we had a national soccer team, but now we didn't have. Before the Taliban, every girls can go to school, but now not.
Mohib, you researched the impact of conflict and violence in Afghanistan. How dangerous is it for those who worked with coalition forces?
It's very dangerous. To say it briefly, since the fall of the whole Afghanistan, if we start with the fall of Kandahar, the Amnesty International released a report only on Kandahar where the suggestions are that up to 1,000 people were either tortured or assassinated or taken away from their families where their whereabouts are unknown. The Human Rights Watch did another report in December 2021 that sort of looked at the widespread, when Taliban took the control, how the amnesty that they announced has been implemented, and they have recorded cases of killing, torturing, disappearance, and all that. So it's a very high-risk situation for people who had worked for international forces, who had worked for international aid agencies, and who have worked for the past government of Afghanistan.
Know how many Sikhs have fled Afghanistan since last year?
Possibly 2,000 around.
And whereabouts have they fled to?
Countries like UK and Canada. Here in Australia, we got only 10 families.
The Australian government has allocated 31,500 visas for Afghan nationals over the next 4 years. William, you're an emeritus professor of diplomacy. You specialise in Afghanistan. Has the government done enough to resettle those who helped coalition forces?
No, I don't think so, really. It was far too late in moving to recognise vulnerability in the run-up to the collapse last year, and the closure of the Australian Embassy in Kabul in May 2021 significantly compromised the capacity to mount any kind of accelerated evacuation.
Paul, you were contracted to work at the Australian Embassy in Kabul in 2012. What did you do there?
I was a static guard commander there at the Australian Embassy, so part of the diplomatic security team there. And it was our role to protect the Australian diplomats, the Australian staff there, and also train the local engaged staff, so the local Afghan troops and the security teams there.
How do you feel about Australia's efforts to evacuate those people you worked with?
Look, I think I can resonate with what a lot of everybody's saying tonight, and I believe personally that it was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction at the end. It's a situation where if the government had planned it a little bit more thoroughly, we could have got a lot more people out earlier, and we could have done it safer, we could have done it more covertly. We could have had people with visas leaving the airport, not in mass droves like we saw during the evacuation, but systematically we could have had people leave the country, so it didn't indicate that there was a mass exodus, but it could have been a lot safer and a lot more practical.
Julian, you served in Afghanistan with the Australian Defence Force. What did you make of the evacuation efforts?
With the exception of East Timor in '99, Australia is very good at committing to conflict, as we've seen with Afghanistan and Iraq, but perhaps we're not as well equipped to extract from said conflicts, because invariably we're with a coalition, and for us to withdraw may be looked upon unfavourably by our coalition partners, particularly the US. We're all in, but it's staging, getting that withdrawal, getting the indicators and warnings that things aren't going perhaps as planned, and being able to put our interest first rather than maintaining the broader coalition strategic and diplomatic interests, which are obviously crucial, but that comes at a cost.
For those men and women who were sent to the ground to try and help with those evacuations, what would their position have been like at that airport?
I think it was pretty frenetic. You could see children being thrown over barbed wire and parents just desperate to get their kids to safety, probably at their own cost.
Do you think they had enough support for the job that they were meant to do?
I think they did. A good friend of mine was a commanding officer, and I think they did an excellent job. But some of the footage I've seen of, in tunnels with raw sewage flowing through, and they're jumping over that to get to safety. I think they did their absolute best, and it was at very short notice. And I think they would have had a good sense of achievement in extracting who they could at the time.
Khalid, you left Afghanistan in August last year. Did you ever imagine a repeat of Afghanistan under the Taliban?
No, never. I remember in Kabul, for the recent youngsters, Afghan youngsters had a lot of exposure of the international world. We used to laugh when we would crack jokes with friends, if we have to experience a regime that has to force us to keep beard and not shave. if we have to witness a regime that bans us from wearing neckties to offices. And I used to crack jokes with my female colleagues that if you're forced to wear hijab, you're told to cover your face, and we all would crack jokes on this. And for us, it was like totally impossible scenario. And then we had to witness this right in front of our eyes, which was indeed traumatic, beyond belief, and beyond acceptance to many of us.
The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has told Insight that Australia will judge the Taliban regime by its actions in preventing terrorism, the upholding of human rights, especially of women and girls, and an inclusive government. William, do you think easing sanctions will help the people of Afghanistan?
I think it's unlikely that it'll happen, and I think part of the problem is that the Taliban have a bad reputation for seeking to manipulate international systems to their own advantage. They're getting about $2 billion at the moment through customs revenues collected at the various entry points into Afghanistan, but there's not much evidence that much of that material is actually being distributed to help vulnerable people.
How secure is the Taliban as the country's government?
I think it's rather more vulnerable than a lot of reporting would suggest, that a lot of people who joined the Taliban when they were on a roll don't necessarily love them, and if they begin to look like losers, they could actually encounter people switching sides. I'm not convinced that armed opposition within Afghanistan is that much of a threat to the Taliban at the moment, although it could become so in the future. The Taliban are, in their value system, just radically at odds with the values of the bulk of the Afghan population.
David, you served in the Australian Defence Force in Afghanistan in 2012. How did you feel when you saw those scenes at Kabul airport a year ago?
I couldn't help but think that it was a tragedy that had been building for 2 decades. Unfortunately, we could see this happening all the way back when I was there, some 10, 11 years sort of before it happened. And unfortunately, the worst case scenario did occur.
What did your service in 2012 involve?
I was the battery captain for a rocket warning system to warn Australian and international forces when Taliban rockets were being fired at our bases. They had killed Australian troops and killed many international coalition troops. And our job was simply to provide warning to the Australian and international forces.
You developed PTSD as a result of your time in Afghanistan. When you returned home, what was life like for you?
Life was surreal. I came home, got married, had a kid, or 2 kids, went back to work. Went back to work like sort of nothing was happening and prepared for the next trip. And it's really hard to go from that grand final moment back to pre-season. And I think I really struggled with that. And it sort of eventually did catch up on me later on after a few years. I was no longer married, no longer lived with my kids, in and out of hospital for about 6 months. I was in a very high-profile position at the time. I was actually living overseas.
Julian, you were in the Defence Force for 17 and a half years. You served in Afghanistan in 2010. How did you feel when you saw Kabul fall to the Taliban last year?
I think it was a shock. I'd only just left end of June, so the flash to bang was very quick. I think the shock of everyone involved from the Australian government, no matter who they work for, must have been very difficult.
If there had been the option to stay longer, do you think that would have changed the situation at all?
I think we have the watchers, they have the time, and they're patient. Another decade, I don't think the end result would have been any different. And I think materially, governments have an end state that they want to achieve, and our mission evolved in Afghanistan quite a number of times. So I don't know what mission success looked like for anyone, and the withdrawal was seized upon by the Taliban, and I guess how rapidly they achieved it was an absolute shock for everyone.
Warren, like Mahbubah, you're trying to get people out of Afghanistan. Warren, how does it weigh on you knowing that many of your former Afghan colleagues cannot leave that country?
It's pretty stressful, especially when I get, excuse me. I get messages from instructors begging to come to Australia.
You get them on your phone?
Yep,
And they just say, can you help me?
yep. Very helpless, very stressed out, that they've given everything to the Australian Government and Defence Force, and we've just sort of, nah, we're not helping you out. We've done our best we can. That's it. Do whatever you can. It's your country, and that's not good enough.
Khalid, how has your first year in Australia been?
Well, apart from being away from home and not choosing to be a migrant when you're compelled to be and you're left with no other options, but then it was very welcoming. We received a lot of warmth, affection from the Australian community, from the people of Australia, particularly from the government. I would say that I was fortunate enough to have been granted a scholarship at the University of Melbourne, where I am currently doing my Master in International Relations, and many other migrants and refugees who came along with me from Afghanistan recently. They are continuing to study here. My sisters are able to go to schools here, which is a plus point for me, because in Afghanistan, under the Taliban regime, it would have never been possible today.
You were a TV presenter in Afghanistan. What's it like being in a TV studio now?
It's like putting a fish back into the water jar or taking a player back to the soccer ground, because being again in the limelight, facing cameras, having a mic, and having the feeling that you're being recorded and your voice is reaching millions. So yeah, it was absolutely an amazing feeling, and I'm grateful to SBS for providing me that opportunity.
You're very generous that you think your voice is going to reach millions on our show, but...
It will, I'm hopeful.
It will. Mona, how is life in Australia for you?
Definitely it's good. It's better than like the Taliban. And I'm so happy. I hope I can play again for my national soccer team, Afghanistan. I hope. And I hope I can play for better clubs like Barcelona, Real Madrid, PSG, like these.
Of course you will.
I'm trying, and I hope I have dream, and I'm trying to get this dream.
Mona, thank you so much. Thank you to you all for joining us tonight. Thank you too for joining us. Dateline is coming up next.